Okay, testing one. Good, I'm live. Awesome. Good morning, everybody. And welcome to our Worship Matters session 26. Wow! Isn't that incredible how time flies? So this morning we're going to look at the history of the choir. I'm going to have a short series about the choir. So this is part one, history of the choir. And in this we're going to look at some pretty fascinating things. I'm focusing specifically on choirs as it relates to religion and church. So I make brief mention of things like concert choirs and oratorio choirs and all that kind of stuff, but I'm focusing mostly on the church choir and how the church choir evolved from ancient times into what we see today. Okay, so next slide, please. What we're looking at now is choirs in the ancient world. Now, choirs as a corporate established entity are very seldom spoken about in ancient writings, but there is mention of groups of people coming together to make music, including singing, and we can consider them to be choirs. The oldest written repertoire for choir that is in existence today, that is the most complete, is ancient Greek. They're called the Delphic hymns, and they date back to the 2nd century BC. There's also a corpus of ancient Greek hymns called the Mesomedes hymns from the 2nd century AD. So, you know, that's a fair time span right there of two sets of ancient Greek hymns. Now, one needs to understand that choir and chorus, as we understand it, mostly had a function in dramas. Okay, the Greeks and the Romans too. So we're not cutting out the Romans, because Greeks and Romans influenced each other, right? We're seeing dramas with costumes, masks, personae. There were certain persona here acting out certain parts. And then there was usually a group of singers, quite often in the background. Sometimes they would have been like the people in the village, or a group of students, or something in the play or the drama that entailed a group of people singing together at the same time. There does exist older written captured music in the world, especially from Babylon and the Middle East. There are tablets that have been found with ancient hymns to the ancient gods, but none of them are as complete as these two collections. Okay, next one. Ancient Rome. As I mentioned before, the classical world did influence each other. There's really no mention per se that the Romans had choirs, but there seems to have been influence from the Greeks that, yes, choirs did exist in ancient Rome as well. Musical dramas, performers sang and spoke. So it is believed that this might have been the early beginnings of what we consider opera. Okay, where you take a fantastical mythological theme or a religious theme. There were religious dramas in the classical world too, and grand costumery and all sorts of glamour. Chorals singing quickly became popular throughout the classical world. One thing that is also very fascinating with the ancient Roman and Greek dramas is that not only did groups of people sing together, but they also spoke together. Okay, it's it's a strange recitation that we're not familiar with here. I do remember in South Africa where we would have Eisteddfod competitions. You would have choirs that would sing, and you would have choirs that would recite poetry together as well. And to our ears here in North America, it sounds kind of bizarre, hearing like 20 people together speaking at exactly the same time, but it has an incredible impact. So that was quite common in the ancient world, in Roman Greek dramas as well. Next one. Ancient Europe. Now this is the rest of Europe, other than Rome and Greece, of course. The Romans did make note, being very keenly attuned to the arts, that the ancient Germanic peoples, the ancient Teutons, the people up north, the Norse people, as well as the Gauls, and practically really throughout the Celtic world, all the way to the British Isles, did perform music in choral groups, as we identify as choral groups. When they would have their religious rituals, quite often it was nature spirit-based. So they would be worshipping things like the god of the sea, the goddess of the trees, goddess of the moon, god of the sun, and all that. That is all part of the corpus of Druidism. They would have groups of singers. The popular style that the Romans noted was what's called call and response. At the end of our program today, we're actually going to do an African American hymn that is in call and response style. It is very global, this style of singing, very popular in Jewish culture too, ancient times as well as in today's synagogues. If you think of the old Scottish psalms from the Hebrides and the islands up north, with the free Presbyterian churches that don't have organs, you have someone leading. You always have a leader, a cantor or some sort of leader that will start the song, and then the people will respond together. So it's a call and response. And apparently the ancient Germans and the ancient Celts of Europe and Britain were very notorious for this. They were also very notorious for their beautiful brass instruments, by the way. There's an instrument called the Carnix, which looks like a tuba with a dragon's head. And if you go on to America, it's found amongst the Latin Americans, it's found everywhere. But the Germans did notice, the Romans did notice that the rest of Europe used this style of singing quite predominantly. Next. Now we come into our arena where we're coming towards Christianity with the ancient Judaic faith. The first biblical mention of choir is in 1 Chronicles, and it is linked with King David. Now you've got to listen to this because this is mind-blowing. Okay, they all had to come from the house of Levi, so they were all of the holy order of Levites. Okay. He appointed musicians and singers. In the beginning, they were distinct. You couldn't have a singer play an instrument as well and vice versa. They specialized in their areas. There were orchestras and there were choirs, and that was it. They played and sang together, but they did not switch roles. Their roles were distinct. They were highly trained, extremely professional. Orchestras could range from 10 to 13 musicians and featured everything from percussion to strings to woodwinds to brass. Of course, the trumpets and the ram's horns were very popular. It was serious business. It was serious business to have the presence of these people in the temple 24/7. Can you imagine a church choir today being required to perform in the sanctuary of a church 24/7? So it was considered very serious business. Now what they did was that they actually had shifts. They had shifts of musicians and singers. They were cared for, they were clothed, they were fed, they were mollycoddled, and they were housed in special housing units. So sort of like a kind of a cloister or a monastery, if you want to think of it that way, that would take shifts and constantly provide music and worship in the temple. Also note, everybody who was in choirs, they led armies into battle. Isn't that incredible? So can you imagine trumpets blowing, drums being beaten, and all these singers singing to God as they go into battle? Okay, next one. There's a story about Jehoshaphat and the marching armies with the musicians and the choirs in front of them. Initially, it was for men only, temple singing in the Judaic faith. They were trained, as I mentioned before, for 5 full years before they could take on service. They were being trained from the age of 25 to 30, and then they were complete. And that includes musicians too. So they had to go through heavy training, and then they were sung. So you can only assume that they must have been really, really good. They must have definitely been at virtuoso level to study intensely like that for 5 years. Later on, though, shift there was a shift towards abilities of singers rather than the amount of training and their age. So we start hearing of the sons of Levi, which imply youths and children also coming into the temple. The rule there was that the adult men walked in first into the temple. That was just the way it was done. So when they processed into the temple, the adult men first and then the boys behind them. This is where we start seeing things like boys and men's choirs, like what we're familiar with today. If you go to a big cathedral in New York or Montreal or Toronto, or for that matter, Great Britain in particular, you will see big cathedrals with boy choristers and men, which are called lay vicars, by the way. So you have choristers and lay vicars. So we're starting to see the start of this sort of thing happening, where the young boys would sing soprano, treble, by the way. It's funny, the distinction with the sexes and the voice types. Very seldom is a boy with a high voice called a soprano. He's called a treble. Soprano is usually a woman. And it's the same with alto, the next voice down. Alto is usually for a man singing in falsetto, countertenor, because alto, altus, in Latin means high. Well, for a female singing alto, it's not high. She's below the soprano. So she's actually lower. So alto is actually a man singing in the falsetto head voice. For a female, she's called a contralto, which means against the high, okay, which makes more sense. So there is distinction in the choral world as to what the gender of the person is and the role that they're singing. So, okay, we're seeing boy choristers singing treble, filling the temple with their beautiful voices, and the men singing with them as well, presumably in alto, tenor, and bass, but we're not sure if they always sang in harmony. They could have sung just in unison together. Okay, next one. Women and girls did not sing in the temple at any point in history. Here's where we're seeing the male-dominated societies and things. However, that does not mean that females did not get together and sing and worship. They did, and it is mentioned several times in the Bible. One prominent is upon exiting Egypt, Miriam and a group of women formed a dancing choir that sang praise to God, and they had tambourines, they had sistrums, all the wonderful ancient things, and, well, a group of ladies dancing and singing. Well, there you go, guys. Okay. And they were praising God for delivering them out of Israel. Women are also mentioned. I did not put their where in the Bible, but they were popular for singing lamentations in mourning sessions, for mourning the dead. Here's an interesting thing as well, is that the women were drawn from the house of Levi as well. They were Levites, female Levites. So there seems to be this thing about this holy order of Levites that are linked with priesthoods and providing music for religious rituals and ceremonies. Okay, next. Okay, here's another one. Ezra mentions groups of men and women. So this is mixed group, which was not common in those days. Usually they were separated. But here's groups of men and women singing praises to God upon returning to Jerusalem after the Babylonian exile. Again, it doesn't say that it was a formal, established corpus that regularly sang, but indicates that a group of people just got together and praised God. So in a way, it's kind of an impromptu choir, if you will, indicating that mixed group singing outside of a formal religious setting was actually quite common. Okay, next. Later in the synagogue, they call them cult. They call them temple cult. And then after the Babylonian exile, we have what's called the synagogue cult. Because after the Babylonian exile, there was no temple rituals anymore. Now it was synagogue. We have the call and response coming in, and he's called the cantor. It's usually a male. But remember this, in today's society, all religions have different branches, just like Christianity. You have very liberal branches, you have anything in between, all the way to very conservative Orthodox. And the same goes for Judaism. You have extremely left-wing, radical liberal groups, anything in between, all the way to the strict Orthodox, where they wear the black hats and the tassels. So cantor doesn't always have to be a man in today's world. There are actually female cantors, and there are female rabbis too, believe it or not. So things do change. And then the cantor will call the response, and then a choir will give the call, and then the choir will respond. And quite often the response will include the congregation too, unless specified, unless it's a special ritual thing that only the choir and the cantor do. But usually the congregation will join in too. Okay, next one. This is a contemporary a praise and worship song, but it is in the Hebrew Jewish style, and it has Hebrew in it. Don't fret, there's English as well. That is a direct translation of the Hebrew that you will hear, Kadosh, which means holy. So it is the three holies, holy, holy, holy Lord God of hosts, in Hebrew and in English, and it just has a typical Middle Eastern Hebrew sound. Just to give you a feel. Kadosh, 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 Adonai Elohim Tzavaot, Adonai Elohim Tzavaot. Holy, holy, holy. Holy, holy, holy. O Lord our God, Lord of hosts. O Lord our God, Lord of hosts, who was and who is and who is to come, who was and who is and who is to come. Holy, Kadosh, 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 Adonai Elohim Tzavaot, Adonai Elohim Tzavaot, Asher Haya Ovev Yavo, Asher Haya Ovev, who was and who is is to come, who was and who is and who is to come, to come. Now you can just imagine something like that sung by a 30-member orchestra, and apparently with up to 50 singers, some of which were children and youths, singing very high sopranos. It probably would have just been absolutely spine-tingling, beautiful, with the trumpets blowing and all that. The choirs in the temple, by the way, were also used to signal the start and the end of the sacrifices. So when they started doing the blood sacrifices to sprinkle the blood on the mercy seat in the Holy of Holies, the choir, first the trumpets would blow and then the choir would start singing. Okay, choirs in medieval times. So now we're moving into that funny crossroads of, it's sort of ancient, but it's sort of wanting to shift into something else in the medieval and Middle Ages times. This is, the Dark Ages is marked by the collapse of the Holy Roman Empire, where the barbarians would invade from the north and just totally obliterate Rome and all that. That is the starting of the Dark Ages in the medieval period. Of course, we have to take what the Romans wrote with a grain of salt, because they could have been just as barbarian, couldn't they? Yes, so there we go. It's all about politics, right? So there was a miscellaneous mishmash of various chants floating around what used to be the Holy Roman Empire. You have the French Catholics have their special Frankish chants and stuff, and Gallic chants going on there. You have the Spanish and the Portuguese with their special Mozarabic influenced chants going on. And then you have this group here, you have the Byzantines in Turkey. It's just chants everywhere, even city to city. You have Milan has different, there's the Ambrosian chants. So Pope Gregory said, okay, enough of this. We need to gather everything up and see what we're going to keep and what we're going to get rid of, which, by the way, is the same thing that happened with the Council of Nicaea with the formation of the Bible. Oh no, we're not going to use this book, we're going to put this. So sometimes it's worthwhile exploring the books that were actually not included as well, by the way. So at any rate, going back to music and staying away from stuff that I might not know much about, he ordered a formal formation of a group called the Gregorian Chants to be in a volume established. Okay. Normally they were sung in unison by trained singers, quite often monks, and there was no harmony, there were no instruments. A pitch would be given, and then off they would go. Okay? One of the tricks that the monks would learn to sight read, I didn't include it here, but I do know this, is that they would use their hand to measure the intervals. So if their thumb was the basic root note, like of the do, re, mi, fa, so, it would be do, re, mi, fa, so, la, la, ti, do. They would count on their fingers, and they would figure out the intervals, and that's how they would learn the pieces, to the point at which they were so proficient that eventually they could just look at the score and start singing. And it does happen with musicians. It happens with me quite often. I take music books on the bus and the train when I'm traveling, and instead of reading magazines, I'm reading music scores. And I can actually hear it in my head as I'm reading it. So it really is quite a lot of fun. I can keep myself entertained for hours reading through scores. So, okay. Unaccompanied, they sung in what's called the ancient church modes, and you will get to hear some of the church modes today. Some of it sounds very odd to our ears. It's a scale system. Today we use major and minor. Okay, the major is what we untrained musicians would say sounds happy. Okay, so there's your scale, there's your major scale. but the relative minor of that sounds what they call sad. But in ancient times, there were many more scales other than that. Okay, and in the next slide, you will see a list that I formulated of the basic ones. Okay, next. These are the 7 basic ones. There are others in between, but I'm not going to go into too much detail. There's actually 12 scales, but I've put 7 here. The first one is Ionian. It's the one that sounds happy. Okay, that's our major scale. Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, and Mixolydian sound very odd to our ears today because it sounds like a normal scale, but there might be a funny sharp or a flat in there that we normally wouldn't use. And I'm going to play a psalm for us to sing in a little bit, and I'm going to play it for you in the modern notation scale, and then I'm going to play it for you in the ancient times, and it was still used during the Renaissance and the Baroque too. Locrian is very bizarre. It's a very bizarre scale. It's not used for anything other than some radical progressive jazz and blues, because this is the scale. Doesn't that sound just very weird? I mean, that's the scale. So it's really not used for anything other than some jazzy scales and things like that. So yes, we're going to listen to one in the Mixolydian mode in a little while, which is a Genevan psalm. It's in our hymn book. Okay, next one. Choir stalls in medieval times. This is your typical monastic choir stall. Okay, this is actually in a monastic church in Spain. As you can see, there are clear divisions. Some of them are even more dramatic than what you see there. And what's really interesting is if you go up to the abbey in Mission, the Franciscan Abbey in Mission, which is called Westminster Abbey, by the way, quite interesting. The choir stalls also have divisions like that. That is part of the no touchy-touchy, okay, in the monastic orders. You're not to touch, you're not to experience anything sensual at all. Some of them are even more cubicalized than that. So no touching, you're not even allowed to look at each other. Okay, you look at the director who's leading and that's it. Okay, next one. As far as medieval architecture goes, Britain and Europe in general is full of old medieval churches that, of course, at one point used to be monastic or tied to the Catholic Church. In this case, this is a church in Great Britain, in England, that used to be Roman Catholic, and of course now is a Church of England, High Church of England. You can see the pipe organ, section of the pipe organ. The main section is way further up top. What you're seeing right there is what's called the choir organ. That's the lower keyboard. And quite oftentimes the pipes would be in its own special little case and lower down close to the choir. You can see the choir screen dividing, and beyond that is the rest of the congregation. So there really was the idea that choirs and organs and that are not to be visual focus of worship. You're to hear the music and focus on the cross and focus on the images in the glass-stained windows, not on the choir itself. Okay, next. Oh, as you can see here, by the way, is that this is a more modern cathedral choir. It's mixed. There's a little girl standing there, so there's girls, there's women at the back on that side, as well as men and boys. We're starting to see more and more of that happening in cathedral choirs. They're not all just boys and men. Girls and women are now starting to come in. Thank goodness, because I do enjoy the richness and the depth of female singers. Even when they cut out vibrato and sound like boy choristers, they can go really high, but there's a certain depth and richness in their voices too. Okay, next. I'm going to sing for you right now a Sanctus and Benedictus from Missa Defunctorum, which is a mass for funerals. But this Sanctus is just absolutely beautiful. And quite honestly, at my funeral, I wouldn't mind if a group of singers came together and did this for me or for my loved ones. So I will play it accompanied. Well, maybe first I will not do accompaniment. Today, Gregorian chants have accompaniments. So I will go through it twice, and then once unaccompanied. And I gave a copy upstairs to Kelly, and she makes a smashing good tenor, by the way. She and I oftentimes do Gregorian material together. And then I will include the organ. Sanctus, Sanctus, Sanctus Dominus Deus Sabaoth, pleni sunt celi et terra gloria tua. Hosanna in excelsis, benedictus qui venit nomine Domini. Hosanna in excelsis. Sanctus, Sanctus, Sanctus Dominus Deus Sabaoth, pleni sunt celi et terra gloria tua. Hosanna in excelsis, benedictus qui venit in nomine Domini. Hosanna in excelsis. Wasn't that lovely? Kind of eerie, but kind of majestic and beautiful too. Now, as you notice, it started in one key and then ended in another. That's another feature of modal music, is that sometimes it throws us modern musicians for a total loop, because we think it's going to go one way because of our training, and suddenly, no, it's not going that direction. Okay, next. I just love singing this kind of stuff, by the way. It really touches me deep down inside. Renaissance, choirs during the Renaissance. So this is the 1500s, right? This is the time of upheaval. This is the time of great inventions. This is the time of people locking themselves away and not sleeping for hours, drawing pictures of helicopters, like Mr. Da Vinci. He drew pictures of what we think of as ancient helicopters and tanks. So this is a time of great innovation, great invention, the Renaissance, the rebirth in French, right? This includes music as well. Carryover of Gregorian chants, the modal system, yes, definitely. But there were shifts and changes starting to happen. We're starting to see harmony. We're starting to see experimenting with the chants. We're starting to see polyphonic arrangements. Polyphonic means that you have several voices in different pitches coming in and out and phasing in and out independent of each other. Okay, remember I mentioned to you that there's homophonic singing, where all the voices sing the same syllables and change at exactly the same time. So if you think of our modern hymns today, if you were singing alto, tenor, bass with the soprano, you would all shift your words together at the same time. Polyphony is different. You could have the sopranos coming, I to the hills will lift. Then the alto comes in, I to the hills will lift. And they're all independent. But yet they fit in somehow. So that's polyphony. I call it a salad. I call it a musical salad. Okay, because you have tomatoes, you have onion, you have everything all chopped up and mixed up, yet somehow together it makes a beautiful meal. Okay, so we see motets happening, polyphony, where they would take the Gregorian chants. And here's something really confusing for you. Sometimes the different parts would be singing different words. So, okay, which one am I listening to now, actually? So, specialized singing, special training, but also special listening and getting used to it. Modal scales were still used. Men sang in church choirs still during this period, so women were not usually included in ecclesiastical choirs. They included, of course, the boy trebles, but also a new breed of male singer called the castrati. And if you take the first couple of letters of the word, you'll understand what it is actually implying. This is where boys are castrated before they hit puberty. So when they become adults, they maintain their youthful appearance, they maintain their youthful bodies, but also their youthful voices. So you will have fully grown men right up into the 30s, 40s, and 50s who are able to sing right along with the little boys and hit those very, very high notes naturally, not forcefully or anything like that. You have countertenors, which is the alto part sung by men in falsetto head voices, which is what you heard me just doing, right? I to the hills will lift my forehead eyes. I forgot the words, it's that sad. So that is a countertenor, and usually they would be singing the alto part, but sometimes soprano too, tenors and basses as well. So we're singing an explosion suddenly of choral music, different parts, different things happening. It's becoming really exciting. Composers are becoming very inspired and starting to write some great works, quite often unaccompanied, by the way, and sometimes accompanied, but in church usually they were unaccompanied. Okay, next one. Trained professionals, singers usually had to study to sing in these churches. During the Reformation, which is also in this time span, we see that the grand pappy of the Reformed churches, the Lutheran Church, was very much still in favor of church music, singing, choirs. They loved the organ. Luther loved music in church. He loved choirs and he loved the pipe organ. This was seen as a carry-through from the Church of Rome. Now, what you need to understand is that Luther's intention was not actually to start a whole different branch of Christianity. The idea of the Reformation was to reform the church of the day. Okay, so all the traditions and all the rites and rituals of the Church of Rome were intended to be kept, but the polity and the theology of the church was what was supposed to be reformed, but ended up a total split later on. Instead of using Latin in the German churches, German, of course, was used so that people could understand what they were singing and what they were listening to. Another branch of the Reformation, the Protestants and the Calvinists, is a whole different story. Here they definitely wanted a clean break from the Church of Rome. A lot of suspicion, a lot of moving away from things that they viewed as being too Catholic, including choral singing, fancy music, ornaments, visual decorations and things within the church, and including the organ, as we mentioned before when we did the series on the organ. Okay, John Calvin in Switzerland, in the French-speaking Calvinist churches that broke out there, he did allow choral singing too, by the way. Initially it was children that sang the Genevan Psalms. The idea is that children are pure, which is brought into question in theology today, because the Bible says we're all born in sin. So at any rate, that's a whole discussion for another day. But at any rate, Calvin regarded children's voices as sounding pure, and hopefully it would inspire the adults closer towards purity. He did allow composers, some of them very, very, very beautiful composers, to compose the corpus of the Genevan Psalters starting around 1551 in Geneva. Initially, these were arranged with very basic block homophonic harmonies to be sung together at the same time. But later on, some Renaissance composers got their hands on these beautiful psalms and started writing big, beautiful, florid, polyphonic arrangements of these works, really to be done by professional trained choirs quite often unaccompanied, and quite often they would be up in a loft somewhere, sometimes as small as a quartet of trained singers were used during the Renaissance as well. Sometimes they weren't full choirs. They had special lecterns, kind of like this one, but with another section over here, so it was like a pyramid. And what they would do is that two singers would stand this side and two would stand that side facing each other. And the choral music would be in a big book that looked like a big ledger book. And it was placed on the apex of the pyramid, and it was opened both ways. And on this page were these two singers' music printed so that it would face them correctly. And on this side were the two parts for these singers facing correctly. So it's actually quite ingenious if you think of it. You just need one book, and then you just open that baby up into like a tent, and then those two singers there can read their parts, and these two here can read theirs. Very, very interesting. Of course, later on, okay, the old modal scales were still used. The Calvinists did permit mixed choirs in church, so now we're starting in the Reformation to see female involvement in church music. Next one. Now we're going to look at a Genevan psalm. I've only put 2 verses. It is 7 verses long. We will be here till the end of our session if we sang them all. It's Psalm 116, I Love You, Lord. So first of all, it's from a later Genevan Psalter, 1562, but still within the Renaissance period. In our hymn book, they eliminated the mode and transcribed it into a modern scale. So I'm going to play it first in the modern scale, then I will play it in its original, and then you'll hear the difference, and then we'll sing 2 verses in the modal style. So first the modern version. Now I will play it in its original version, and then we'll sing it. To me and heard my cry for mercy, anguished by death and overcome by sorrow, I turn my head distressed to you in prayer. Our God is gracious, merciful, and just, who watches over all the simple-hearted, resting us, God, for salvation. Remember all the goodness shown to you. Amen. So as you can hear, there's sort of like an extra little minor chord in there now and then. That is very typical of modal music. That's the Mixolydian mode, what they call the Mixolydian. Sounds like a major key, but there's a funny little minor in there somewhere. Okay, next. Here's our beautiful church in the sunset. Churches during the 17th and 18th century sort of a carryover of Renaissance traditions were still alive. You've got to understand that, again, there aren't always clear-cut begin, end, but usually superimposing is happening. Choral traditions, as we currently are familiar with, become established. Cathedrals still feature trained boy choristers and men, so we still have the trebles and the lay vicars, the choristers and the lay vicars. However, we're starting to see a shift from specialized trained professional groups in big affluent churches, and we're starting to see choirs forming in smaller suburban village, small towns and rural churches. Now you need to understand, because there's no King's College, because there's no Oxford and Cambridge out in the country, way up north, out in the moors, you're seeing more amateur choirs forming. So that's what I mean by church choirs as we know today. So these smaller churches feature mixed choirs. Sometimes children are included, sometimes youth, adults, some trained, some have some experience, some not at all. Okay, next. Choral repertoire varied from highly demanding and complex, meant for expert trained singers, which is what we're seeing in the bigger urban churches and the metropolitan churches and cathedrals, to simpler works with easier harmonies for amateur singers, oftentimes just sitting back on the loft. Okay, we have the West Gallery type singing that was very popular in the Georgian period. And the Victorian era, they tried to eliminate and get rid of these ragtag, pulled together amateur choirs and tried to bring in professional choirs, but professional choirs in a small village church, I mean, come on. So, you know, at the end of the day, these amateur church choirs still won out, and they were still very popular. Complex oratorios and cantatas were really reserved for the trained singers, quite often concert and cathedral choirs or big oratorio choirs. Amateur choirs usually stuck to singing hymns and psalms, sometimes special arrangements for choir, but generally those big, really difficult things that required a big symphonic orchestra and a huge 120-member choir, kind of like the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, just really did not fit into these smaller churches. Okay, next. Choirs from 19th to 20th century, we're still seeing a carryover of a lot of the older traditions right up into the 20th century. Cathedrals, large metropolitan churches still featured the boys choristers and the men lay vicars. However, like we saw in that photo that I briefly showed you, during the 20th century, we start seeing girls and women starting to sing in these big cathedrals. Sometimes they were separate. This is a girls' choir or a women's choir or a girl and women's choir. And sometimes they were mixed. Other times you would have a mixed chorus in a cathedral that was separate from the traditional boy choristers and the lay vicars. So sometimes you would have 2 or 3 different choirs within a big cathedral. Okay, next. Smaller suburban churches, village and rural churches, we're still seeing going strong, mixed amateur groups, some highly trained, some moving from the cities into the countryside for some peace and quiet, others total amateurs but very eager to sing and learn. Wonderful scenario. It's a lot of fun working with mixed groups like that. Now, as I said, during the Victorian period, there was a move to try and get rid of these West Gallery amateur groups, which to the Victorians sounded absolutely horrendous. But to the villagers, it was like, I can't wait to go to church. I just love the music. But the Victorians were like, oh, no, we need to bring in the cathedral style of worship into these churches. It failed. Ultimately, it failed miserably. Exclusive children choirs became very popular during this time. They were being trained by their teachers and their conductors, and they were gaining experience. We're seeing things like little concert choirs, we're seeing Vienna boys choirs, we're seeing all of this sort of thing starting to happen, where children are being trained to sing, quite oftentimes in parts too. And some of it is quite complex. You can't think children are singing this. Okay, next. This is a typical sort of scene that we would see in a somewhat larger church. Maybe it's a city church or a large town, where it's a mixed group. There's young women, there's mature adult women, there's older men. So it's a real pull-together group coming together to sing. This is a typical cathedral-style layout with a split choir. So it's reminiscent of the old medieval churches with the split choirs. During those times, you would see things like Choir 1 and Choir 2. Now, the classical layout of these churches was that where you entered the church was west. When you looked at the front of the church where the high altar was, that was east. So they were always aligned east-west like that, with the sides of the church being north and south. You had a dark side, and you had a sunny, bright side. Okay. On this dark side, the north side of the cathedral and church, the stained glass windows, this is just an aside note, by the way, featured all the Old Testament stories and things portrayed in the glass. And on this side was the New Testament things on the warm, hot, sunny side. Okay? And the choir split in half. The main choir was the south one. On the sunny side, it was called cantus. And on the north side was called decantus. And quite oftentimes they would do singing back and forth to each other as well. So one choir would make a statement, and then quite often the other one would echo it and repeat something or create an answer to the choir singing. So cantus and decantus singing back and forth as a split choir. Don't know if you could pull it off with a smaller choir like this. You might. If you had enough experienced singers, you could. Big cathedral choirs, definitely, yes. You see it quite often in the Orthodox tradition too. Okay, next. This is typical from coming out of the classical period, sort of bridging into the Romantic Victorian era. This is from Franz Schubert's Mass. Okay, the Holy, 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 the Sanctus. It is in our hymn book. It is delightfully simple and everybody can sing it. Okay, so I've actually put the words in there and we are going to sing it together. Now, apart from congregations singing this, this is suitable for untrained singers too. So it's really great for that mishmash, beautiful, colorful, ragtag group of people calling themselves the church choir. And it's like, you know, we don't always have to have these big, fancy, demanding pieces. It can be beautiful and simple like this too. and rules forever, all beneath the sun. Holy, 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 God Almighty Lord. Holy, 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 everywhere adored. Power and love and wonder, circling round God's throne. Praise our God most holy, Lord of life alone. Beautiful, isn't it? Okay, there's that lovely sunset over the sea. So as we can see, with coming into the 20th century, choral repertoire can range from extremely challenging and complex for trained expert choirs to fairly simple, melodious, simple harmonizations for untrained and amateur singers. Any singer who runs through this a couple of times, whether they come from the Metropolitan Opera House or whether they come from a small little farm in Saskatchewan, would most probably master it with a couple of run-throughs, even in parts. The parts are not that difficult, the harmony parts. The latter part of that cluster of music, of course, became increasingly popular because, hey, the smaller churches are way outnumbering the gigantic cathedrals and big metropolitan churches, especially in the New World. You're singing little churches and parishes popping up all over the place. They don't have access to expert trained musicians and singers. They have to make do with whatever they can find. So we're finding simpler, easier pieces for volunteer choirs becoming very popular now. I see that it is starting to overtake the professional, and now the cathedrals are sort of starting to feel sort of like, wait, hold on a minute. You know? So there is a move to try and preserve the traditional trained boy choristers and the lay vicars and stuff still going on, because they are currently under threat, because churches are just going into this direction way more. I like to keep a balance. I like them both. I'm happy that there's big cathedrals that can still sing Stanford and all the grand cathedral music, but I'm also appreciative of the smaller churches with their volunteer choirs. Okay, next. Arrangers and composers began in the 20th century to explore other music, other than American or Eurocentric. There's this realization that, wait a minute, there's Christians all over the world, and they don't all sound like North Americans or English or French or whatever. They have their own flavor, their own style, their own ambiance. So we're seeing composers and arrangers in the West exploring music from Africa, from Asia, the Caribbean islands, Latin America, and the Pacific Islands, and anywhere else where there's a little group of Christians. I've heard some beautiful East Indian Christian music played with the traditional instruments, the sitar and their special drums and their flutes and things, just absolutely lovely stuff. So choral arrangements are starting to appear in the 20th century of hymns and spiritual songs coming from these parts of the world, as well as popular songs like the gospel songs, the African American spirituals and songs, and sometimes new Christian lyrics set to old familiar folk tunes is starting to happen as well. Becoming very popular in probably a little less traditional churches. You may hear some of this type of music in the cathedrals when they're exploring and trying out new different things, but usually it's the other congregations like the Methodists and the Unitarians and sometimes the Presbyterians and so on. Baptists in particular, they would particularly be very open to this. Okay, next. And by the way, the Catholic Church is not immune to that too. They really do enjoy bringing in some more contemporary stuff from around the world. We're starting to see this. Isn't that incredible? Just look at those faces. Okay, we're starting to see ethnic groups, ethnic choirs. They're even coming into cathedrals and singing. They're all over the world now becoming very popular, and they have been becoming popular for quite a while. Okay, possibly back even to the 18 and 1700s even. There were groups of non-European choirs. So we're seeing all of this, but still look at the robes and all of that. So they're still holding on to certain traditions, right? Like the robes and that. And they're actually quite proud of their robes. If you look at the African American and the African choirs from Africa itself, they really love their colorful robes. Okay, next. Choirs today. We're seeing increasing repertoire of what we term the praise and worship songs and praise and worship music and modern hymns starting to be arranged for choir. Some of them are really, really quite breathtaking. Some of them are even arranged for orchestra with a choir. You can hear a lot of them in Britain's Songs of Praise as well. You can hear beautiful arrangements of more modern praise and worship songs. There's a slow shift away from the classical, traditional look and feel of choir, where the choir marches down the aisle very stern and very, this is serious business and splitting up and coming up in their nice robes and everything. We're starting to see a shift away from that. We're starting to see younger people wanting a little bit more casual. Choral attire is being dropped in some churches today, giving it a slight, perhaps for some eyes, a little bit of a ragtag kind of incoherent group, but that is what the younger people are liking. They're liking their individuality rather than all looking like bees working for the queen sort of thing. We're seeing the increased use of bands. Now that doesn't mean organ is being abandoned entirely. It's just that bands are now, and orchestras too, by the way, are starting to be used way more in more contemporary groups, contemporary choirs. Some of the repertoire can be quite challenging. I have seen contemporary choral music based on contemporary praise and worship songs that I look at it and I'm like, you know what? That'll take a singer that has been studying for no less than 3 or 4 years. So it's not all dumbed down or simple stuff. Some of it is quite complicated and would require really excellent musicians and singers too. Some of them go very high. It's like, whoa, I wish I could get a group of sopranos that could reach the rafters like that. But yeah. Okay, next. We're going to close off our program today. We're a little over time, but not too bad. This is an African American spiritual, and it is in our hymnal. Now, what I would like to do, Kelly, if you could just show the next slide. This is going to be interesting. Okay. The red words that says everyone are all of you. Okay? And it is always something about I know the Lord and laying his hands. So this is a call and response song. I will sing the calls, which will be in blue. You'll see the next one. It says leader. So I will sing, did ever you see the like before? And then you will respond, I know the Lord's laid his hands on me. And then we do the refrain together. So let me sing the blue, and then you folks all sing the red. How's that? Okay, Kelly will be singing from the top. She will sing the refrain part that the congregation is to sing, and I will do the leader part in blue. So it's blue and red. Let's just have fun. Okay, this is a real hootenanny African-American gospel style. The organ is going to sound like a big Wurlitzer with vibratos going and everything. So this is typical flavor of people just letting rip and having a good time praising God, which is quite allowable. Okay, where's my vibrato? There we go. the Lord, I know the Lord, I know the Lord laid his hands on me. Oh, I know the Lord, I know the Lord, I know the Lord laid his hands on me. Did ever you see the like before? I know the Lord laid his hands on King Jesus preaching to the poor. I know the Lord laid his hands on me. Oh, I know the Lord, I know the Lord, I know the Lord laid his hands on me. Oh, I know the Lord, I know the Lord, I know the Lord laid his hands on me. Oh, wasn't that a happy day? I know the Lord laid his hands on me. When Jesus washed my sins away, I know the Lord laid his hands on me. Oh, I know the Lord, I know the Lord, I know the Lord laid his hands on me. Oh, I know the Lord, I know the Lord, I know the Lord laid his hands on me. Some seek the Lord and don't seek him right. I know the Lord laid his hands on me. They fool all day and pray at night. I know the Lord laid his hands on me. Oh, I know the Lord, I know the Lord, I know the Lord laid his hands on me. Oh, I know the Lord, I know the Lord, I know the Lord laid his hands on me. My Lord's done just what he said. I know the Lord laid his hands on me. He healed the sick and raised the dead. I know the Lord laid his hands on me. Oh, I know the Lord, I know the Lord, I know the Lord's laid his hands on me. Oh, I know the Lord, I know the Lord, I know the Lord's laid his hands on me. Wasn't that cute? Maybe we should do that some Sunday and introduce it to the congregation just for fun, right? Let them try something totally different. Anyway, folks, it's been a wonderful time with you again. Thank you so much for being here and sharing this with me. We're going to go to part 2 of the choir next time, Thursday the 26th. Same time, same place. We're going to look at in-depth working with the choir. This is going to be very subjective, okay, because you're looking at it from my perspective, 32 years of working with choirs in churches. I'm going to share some stuff with you. We're going to sing some stuff together. Just for fun, we're going to try some things together. And yeah, it should be quite an eye-opener. I'm quite sure you're going to learn about what goes on behind the scenes. When you see the choir up here on Sunday morning, you have no idea of what they had to go through to get where they are. So that is our next session on the 26th. Thank you so much. God bless. Take care and see you again. Bye-bye.